The next bill on the calendar is Senate Bill 831. To offer an amendment, the chair recognizes Senator Muth.
Fine. Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to offer Amendment A03948 to Senate Bill 831 and ask for its immediate consideration.
Senator Muth offers the following amendment and moves its immediate adoption. The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment number A3948.
On the amendment, the chair recognizes Senator Muth.
Thank you, Mr. President. My amendment would simply indicate that no costs related to the development, maintenance, or construction of carbon capture, sequestration, and the provisions outlined in this legislation can be passed on to utility customers via rate increases. According to a report released just a few weeks ago by nonprofit Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, the cost of electricity from power plants outfitted with carbon capture devices is at least 1.5 to 2 times more expensive than alternatives. Again, it is much more affordable and less dangerous to our communities, residents, and environment to rely on and to allocate state resources on the build-out of renewable energy like solar, wind, and hydro. A 2021 report by the Government Accountability Office found that the U.S. Department of Energy has actually wasted hundreds of millions of dollars on failed CCS projects, spending over $684 million to support such projects at 6 coal plants, and only one of them ever came online. Fossil fuel companies typically pump that captured carbon into underground to, quote, store it, but they usually do so in a process called enhanced oil recovery, a tactic used to push up hard-to-reach oil reserves, which companies can then sell as carbon-neutral oil. Nothing in the current bill prohibits the use of CCS for enhanced oil recovery and this technology, and the bill at issue here is being used by fossil companies to cast themselves as climate heroes even as they drill for more oil. Relying on CCS to prop up fossil fuels will likely raise electricity bills for our constituent, and my amendment will ensure that that is not the case here in Pennsylvania. Fossil fuel companies and their affiliates cannot increase ratepayers' utility bills to recoup costs from CCS build-out if my amendment should be adopted. I would also like to note that the National Federation of Independent Business enthusiastically supports this amendment. I ask my colleagues for an affirmative vote on this amendment to protect all of our constituents across this Commonwealth from corporate polluters and price gouging. Thank you, Mr. President.
Chair thanks the gentlelady. Chair recognizes Senator Pittman.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I move the amendment be laid upon the table.
Senator Pittman moves that the amendment be laid upon the table. That motion is not debatable. On the motion to table the amendment, the clerk will call the roll.
Argel. Aye. Almond. Aye. Baker. Aye. Bartolotta. Aye. Boscola. No. Brewster. No. Brooks. Aye. Brown. Aye. Capoletti. No. Coleman. Aye. Collette. No. Comita. No. Costa. No. Culver. Aye. Dillon. No. DeSanto. No. Dush. Aye. Ferry. Aye. Flynn. No. Fontana. No. Gephardt. Aye. Haywood. No. Hughes. No. Hutchinson. Hutchinson. Aye. Kane. No. Carney. No. Langerholtz. Aye. Laughlin. Aye. Martin. Aye. Mastriano. Aye. Miller. No. Muth. No. Pennycook. Aye. Phillips Hill. Aye. Pittman. Aye. Regan. Aye. Robinson. Aye. Rothman. Rothman. Aye. Santicero. No. Saval. No. Schwenk. No. Stefano. Aye. Street. No. Tartaglione. No. Vogel. Aye. Ward. Judy. Aye. Ward. Kim. Aye. Williams. Anthony H. No. Williams. Lindsay. No. Y'all. Aye. DeSanta from no to aye.
The vote on the motion is the ayes are 28 and the nays are 22. The ayes have it, and the amendment is laid upon the table. Further, on Senate Bill 831, will the Senate agree to the bill? It's agreed to. This bill has been considered on 3 different days in open Senate and is now before the Senate for final passage. The question is, will the Senate finally pass this bill? The Chair recognizes Senator Yaw.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today in support of Senate Bill 831. Senate Bill 831 would establish a regulatory framework for carbon capture and storage in Pennsylvania. This bill will provide for liability during the operation of a carbon storage facility and long-term monitoring after closure. The Great Plains Institute, using data from a 2009 Department of Conservation and Natural Resources report, estimates that Pennsylvania could store about 2.4 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide underground. This is the equivalent of the level of greenhouse gases emitted from 517 million gas-powered passenger vehicles annually, according to the EPA. Mr. President, this legislation is a proactive step to secure Pennsylvania's future as a hub for carbon capture and sequestration. It is a pragmatic solution to a problem that we all want to solve: reduce our carbon emissions without crippling the reliability of our existing electric grid. This legislation would be an integral part of the establishment of 2 hydrogen hubs that the region was recently awarded. Pennsylvania is uniquely qualified to develop a vast carbon capture and storage network thanks to our robust electric generation industry and extensive geological formations. We must act now to establish a solid regulatory framework that will attract investment, development, and economic opportunity for decades to come. I would also like to note that in a briefing last fall, this bill was supported by the Pennsylvania State Building Construction Trades Council, the Environmental Defense Fund, and the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry. It is also supported by the Allegheny, Fayette, Central Labor Council, and the Greater Pittsburgh Chamber of Commerce. I respectfully ask my colleagues for an affirmative vote on Senate Bill 831. Thank you, Mr. President.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Chair recognizes Senator Comita.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will be voting no on Senate Bill 831. We have talked a lot about the potential of carbon capture, utilization, and storage. I am open to the concept, but I do not support this bill. I'm concerned about the lack of protections for environmental justice communities and the need for additional support to adequately regulate carbon dioxide underground injection wells. That said, I believe that if it's done properly, CCUS may be part of a comprehensive decarbonization strategy. Pennsylvania needs a cohesive, economy-wide approach to net zero that includes a diverse energy portfolio. Most likely, that will include CCUS. But any approach that we take must be done wisely, judiciously, and effectively from environmental, economic, sustainability, environmental justice, and public health and safety standpoints. This legislation does not meet that criteria. I will be voting no. Thank you.
Chair recognizes Senator Muth.
Don't move. Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to speak in opposition, strong opposition to Senate Bill 831 and the overall concept of utilizing carbon capture and storage as some sort of proposed climate solution. Mr. President, as many stakeholders have indicated, this bill is deeply flawed and does not provide the necessary safeguards for our communities or our environment, nor does it provide an actual solution to combating the climate crisis that, regardless of whether you believe it's happening, it's all impacting every single one of us. By no means are my comments today a comprehensive list of all the concerns with Senate Bill 831, but some of them shared with us by some of the stakeholders who oppose this legislation. There's no real discussion around how many miles of pipeline will need to be built and where these pipelines will be built relative to actually transporting this captured carbon and how it will be injected into the ground. Stakeholders have indicated that this could cause issues putting these carbon capture pipelines through highly populated areas, even deemed as a utility, such as the Mariner East pipeline was deemed as a utility, despite it does not provide any resource for anyone's electric utilities, but rather is sent overseas to manufacture plastics. We have talked about how climate solutions are needed, but capturing carbon cannot be the centerpiece of any serious climate plan. Its track record makes it clear that this is, again, just another way of extending the profit-driven fossil fuel industry to continue what they've done for decades, which is loot and pollute our Commonwealth and really the world. As I quote Food and Water Watch, an organization fighting for clean air and clean water and a healthier future, said that, quote, betting on carbon capture as a primary solution to the climate crisis is essentially the same as giving up. Mr. President, if we are giving up on our Pennsylvania Constitution that guarantees in Article 1, Section 27 that states that people have a right to clean air, pure water, and to the preservation of the natural, scenic, historic, and aesthetic values of the environment, we need to move to 100% renewable energy, and carbon capture is simply not the answer, no matter how inconvenient that may be to the oil and gas industry. This technology is incredibly expensive, and it is unproven after billions of dollars in both public and private investments over decades. There are no carbon capture success stories, only failures. The reason that the oil and gas industry loves carbon capture is simple. It extends the fossil fuel profit era instead of ending it. A study by the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis said that 13 of the world's biggest projects, accounting for more than half the global carbon capture capacity, found that only 10 of them are either underperforming by large margins, trapping as little as half the CO2 promised, or they have already shut down. In addition to the environmental and economic reasons that this is a terrible idea for Pennsylvania, piping carbon dioxide through communities presents a dangerous threat to public health and safety. To transport captured carbon through pipelines, it's highly pressurized and it must be kept cold, which would require the construction of pipelines that can withstand those conditions. According to the Center for International Environmental Law, condensed carbon dioxide can be corrosive to the steel used to build those very pipelines, increasing the risks of leaks, ruptures, and potentially catastrophic running fractures. Residents in western Mississippi experienced these dangers in real life in 2020 when Denbury Enterprises carbon pipeline ruptured. 300 people were evacuated and 45 people were hospitalized. And this is just a small example of the great harm that can occur due to these ruptures. There are still Pennsylvania families living here today in our state without clean drinking water from the oil and gas industry, destroying the water table below. Instead of giving the fossil fuel industry yet another handout, we should be working together to make sure everyone's constitutional rights are actually upheld and that we all have clean air, clean water, and a future free of pollution and harm. It's time that we actually start enforcing the current regulations that exist and legislating protections for Pennsylvania residents and our environment. I ask my colleagues for a no vote on Senate Bill 831. Thank you, Mr. President.
Chair thanks the gentlelady. The chair recognizes Senator Pittman.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to go to heaven, but I do not want to die. That's the only thing I can think of whenever I hear some of the comments being made on the floor at this moment. One day I hear how terrible my coal-fired power plants are, how terrible it is to put carbon into the atmosphere. And so we come up with a regulatory framework to allow for the potential of not emitting carbon during the production of electricity. And now that is fatally flawed. I hear all about how important it is to have hydrogen hubs in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Many of my friends in the Southeast are excited about hydrogen hubs. But guess what you need for hydrogen hubs? You need pipelines, and eventually you need to sequester some carbon. So what do we want? What do we want whenever it comes to the production of electricity, the production of energy, to power our economy, to power our families, and to, in the minds of some, help the environment? Now, we can go back and relitigate all of the climate conversations that we have day in and day out, but I go back to the district that I represent. The people in my district that produce electricity that happens to emit carbon have been vilified over the last several decades. They have been vilified by so many for producing this electricity and yet somehow destroying the planet. So now we come in front of you with a regulatory framework. Let's be clear, there is no subsidy here. There is no grant, there is no tax credit. What we're establishing is a regulatory framework that if carbon capture sequestration comes to the table in Pennsylvania and becomes a viable source of electricity production, we have a regulatory framework in place. I too have my doubts and my suspicions of the efficacy of carbon capture and sequestration. I'm not convinced it's ever really going to happen. But you know, if it's going to be the next new great thing, then we should put a regulatory framework in place to allow it to occur. But we have to understand, if you're going to go to heaven, you're going to die. That's the reality. And I'm looking here at this piece of paper yet again, where the Pennsylvania State Building and Construction Trades Council supports the legislation in front of us. Family-sustaining jobs are behind this legislation. You want to get rid of family-sustaining jobs when they emit carbon? So be it. But then to stand here and want to oppose an alternative. Working families and those that represent them believe this could be our alternative. So come on. If you want to throw my people out on the unemployment line from their maximum wage jobs, then at least accept a potential opportunity for a different path forward. I ask for an affirmative vote.
Chair recognizes Senator Costa.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise today to lend my support in support of many other members of this side of the aisle, I believe, supporting the need for carbon capture, utilization, and storage as an urgent mechanism for curbing the effects of our climate crisis and ensuring that our families and our grandchildren have a livable planet. Carbon capture is essential for the continued use of fossil fuels while we transition and while we work to transition to a clean energy future. In particular, carbon capture is an important resource with a new and improved electric grid portfolio standard and for the development of hydrogen hub that was recently awarded that the southwestern part of the Pennsylvania region will be able to participate with. Hydrogen is the next generation fuel source that will be part of a longer term solution for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and continued development of the Commonwealth's heavy industry, such as steel and cement manufacturing. However, Mr. President, there is much more work that needs to be done on this regulatory framework as has been described. We have significant questions about how the liability, for example, for future leaks or potential water contamination will be handled. There should not, and the state should not, be left holding the bag as we have in the past with abandoned oil wells and gas wells. We have to address surface owners' rights and pipeline safety concerns, as were mentioned previously by previous speakers, including protecting landowners from forced pooling. We must take steps and must ensure that DEP is properly staffed to permit, enforce, and monitor carbon capture projects as we attempted to do here yesterday. And we have to provide citizens. It's important that we provide citizens with a voice when these projects are proposed for development in their communities and that they are developed properly and how they are developed. Mr. President, I'm moving this measure, in support of this measure, allow it to be moving forward to ensure that we have an opportunity to continue this discussion about how we regulate carbon capture and sequestration here in Pennsylvania. What is going to be required after this advances through this chamber is that we work to find a compromise, find a way in which we all can come to agreement, whether it be Democrats and Republicans, labor and the environmental community, House and administration as well, working together to be able to fashion what an appropriate carbon capture regulatory framework or framework needs to look like as we go forward. So we look forward to working with all parties to be able to get to a place in a bipartisan way that we can address the concerns that folks have raised through this process and that we can come back together here at some point in time with something that I think everyone believes is an appropriate way to address this issue. But for the moment, I'm going to support advancing it through this chamber to be able to allow the process to continue and knowing that there are other stakeholders in this conversation who are asking the same to be given the opportunity to bring to closure what we think is in the best interest of the people of this Commonwealth. So thank you for the opportunity to provide remarks.
Thank you. The chair thanks the gentleman. The clerk will call the roll.
Argel. Aye. Almond. Aye. Baker. Aye. Bartolotta. Aye. Boscola. Aye. Brewster. Aye. Brooks. No. Brown. Aye. Capoletti. No. Coleman. No. Collette. No. Committa. No. Costa. Aye. Culver. Aye. Dillon. Aye. DeSanto. No. Dush. No. Ferry. Aye. Flynn. Fontana. Aye. Gephardt. No. Haywood. No. Hughes. No. Hutchinson. No. Kane. Aye. Carney. No. Langerholtz. Aye. Laughlin. Aye. Martin. Aye. Mastriano. No. Miller. Aye. Muth. No. Pennycook. Aye. Phillips Hill. Aye. Pittman. Aye. Regan. Aye. Robinson. Aye. Rothman. No. Santasero. Aye. Saval. No. Schwenk. No. Stefano. Aye. Street. No. Tartaglione. No. Vogel. Aye. Ward. Judy. Aye. Tartaglione. Aye. Ward. Kim. Aye. Williams. Anthony H. No. Williams. Lindsay. No. Y'all. Aye. Flynn. Aye.
The vote on final passage is the ayes are 30 and the nays are 20. This bill has been passed by the Senate and will be sent to the House of Representatives for its concurrence.